In his discussion of politically emancipated states and of political emancipation more generally, Marx is very critical. He thinks political emancipation is a step in the right direction, but it's insufficient. It's not full freedom. It's not human emancipation. And in a previous video, we focused on the double life that people lead in a politically emancipated state. And in Marx's view, that double life is detrimental to human beings. Um, he identifies our kind of true calling, if that's what he doesn't call it that, but something like that. Our species being, as he puts it, that word shows up again with our public life. Our species being is kind of in some way or another attached to the public life, but that's very alien to us. That's very remote from us. And so we are alien to our own species being. We are alien in some sense to ourselves precisely because of the structure of these politically emancipated states, because we live these double lives with the real individual, with our day-to-day concerns being taken up with the private life, the life in civil society. What I want to do now is focus on a kind of more detailed, pointed criticism that Marx has of these politically emancipated states, what we would call liberal democratic states, right? States that afford equal rights, that have some sort of representative democracy, you know, the kinds of states that populate the world today. That's what he has in mind when he's talking about politically emancipated states. We've already seen some of that criticism. We're going to focus in on another one now, a more pointed one. And this more pointed one concerns the notion of rights. Marx is well aware, and he cites a bunch of documents, constitutions, and so on. He's well aware that these politically emancipated states, a place like France or the United States or the various states of the United States, they prize rights. They see their job as protecting rights. It's not just any old rights. They also give you lists of rights. There are particular kinds of rights that they are aimed to protect, that they hold out as central to their mission. Marx is going to criticize these rights. So he calls them the rights of man, right? So people like Locke and these other classical liberal theorists, the founders, whatever, these people who advocate for these politically emancipated states, they talk about the rights of man, natural rights, these human rights, whatever. That idea, right? Marx and that that's central to what a government should do. The central task of a government is to protect those things. Marx thinks that rights merely serve to reinforce and maintain the politically emancipated state as it is. They keep it in place. They attempt to justify it, right? They offer justifications for this kind of state. And in as much as people, I'm trying to think of a better word, but in as much as people become taken with rights, right? As much as they become brainwashed by this kind of talk, Marx would want to say they will work to maintain the politically emancipated state and will actively oppose any changes for genuine human freedom, for human emancipation. Right? And so these rights are actually fairly dangerous, according to Marx, and they actually serve to keep us alienated from ourselves. These rights do, right? When we talk about human rights and the rights of man and so on. And so what I want to do really quick is look at Marx's discussion of just a few of them. He goes through a number of them. We're just going to go through three of them kind of quickly. Three of these rights of man, these natural rights, these human rights that all human beings have just in virtue of human being, right? This is the idea that people like Locke or other liberal theorists have. Marx is critical of this theory, of this view of things. And we get a picture of the younger Marx there because he wrote this when he was a little bit younger. His main criticism is that these rights, they're not expressions of or guarantees of or they don't help us achieve human emancipation. They're not expressions of human emancipation. They don't reinforce human emancipation. And in fact, he's going to say they're detrimental to human emancipation. They're not the rights of human emancipation. They're the rights of man qua burger, right? They're the rights of the man in civil society. And what that really means is that they reinforce and maintain civil society. Civil society as it exists in the politically emancipated state. They reinforce and maintain the status quo of the politically emancipated society. And that's bad because that stands in the way of genuine human freedom, human emancipation, right? Just to keep it all in mind, political emancipation is a step in the right direction, but it's insufficient. It's not quite human emancipation yet. So let's look at a couple of these rights in detail. Let's start with the right of liberty. So the right of liberty is something like just the right to do, Marx's gloss on it. It's a right to do anything that doesn't harm other people, right? Within your own little sphere, knock yourself out, do what you want. It's a right to do whatever you see fit to do, so long as you don't intrude upon other people's space, right? You don't harm anybody else. Well, what Marx notes about this right is that it seems to be founded upon the separation of people. It treats other people as limitations on your liberty, right? My liberty ends where yours begin. And so other people are kind of impediments, if anything, to my liberty. They limit and block my liberty. And would that there were nobody else around, then I'd be even freer. These rights, when you start thinking this way, when you start taking the right of liberty seriously and thinking that that's an important value, it's going to encourage a kind of individualism, a kind of separation of human beings, an asociality, right? Something like that is his idea. So liberty as a right is founded upon the separation of individuals, and it's the right to be separated. Kind of riffing on a similar idea, he goes on to say something like, to kind of further explain the idea, that people who take the right of liberty seriously, who think that that's a genuine value, they regard human beings as kind of isolated monads, is what he says. A monad is a word for like one unit, right? An isolated individual, an isolated unit, an isolated one thing, right? Something like that. And so in the right of liberty, human beings are regarded as isolated individuals, right? There are no social connections, there are no social ties. Man is not seen as a social animal, but as this kind of isolated monad, isolated individuals who happen to bump into each other. And that's kind of unfortunate when they do, because when they do, they just limit each other's freedom. This is detrimental to genuine human emancipation. Consider the right of property. Marx's gloss on the right of property. It's a right to enjoy your possessions, your holdings, your fortune, whatever you want to call it, and dispose of it as you will without taking any regard for other people. That's what the right of property is. You have stuff, do what you want with it. Don't take anybody else into account. Right? You can't harm people. Okay, fine. But if you want to light your $1,000 bill on fire, knock yourself out, right? That's kind of the idea. It's the right to do whatever you want with your holdings, regardless of other people's needs or desires or interests. And so what Marx wants to say is that the right of property is really just kind of what it does is it reinforces self-interest. Use your property for you. Do what you want to do. Don't worry about other people's needs. Don't worry about other people's interests. What's paramount is your interest. And we're going to protect your interests by, this I can think of it, right? We're going to protect your interests by protecting this right of property, by inventing, Marx would say, this right of property, where The state will now protect your holdings, your possessions, and allow you to do whatever you see fit to do with them, right? You don't need to worry about other people. The state's kind of protecting your right of self-interest. And like with the right of liberty, it leads us to see others as limitations on our liberty. I can kind of do with, and it's a similar idea, I can kind of do with my property what I see fit to do, other than invading your space, other than harming you, something like that, harming your liberty. And so again, other people, you don't realize your freedom in other people or in community. You realize your freedom in this private, self-interested sphere, and other people are merely limitations on your liberty. Lastly, this right of security. What Marx has in mind here, and again, you don't really hear the right of security that much. It's not like the right of property or right of liberty or something like that. But what he has in mind here is the idea that according to proponents of the politically emancipated state, proponents of classical liberal democratic states, society exists in order to preserve the person and their property. Society exists for security. That's why we get together as a community. It's to protect us in our life, liberty, and property. And so society exists really only in order to secure the individual's rights. But then the whole idea behind these politically emancipated states is that the political community is a mere means for preserving rights. And what's central then is you, the individual, and your self-interest. And everything else is supposed to protect that bubble of private self-interest. All of these rights are meant to protect that bubble of private self-interest. And so insofar as we take these rights seriously and we begin to actually believe in them, Marx would say, we begin to see ourselves as isolated monads, as asocial creatures, as beings that are concerned first and foremost merely with our own self-interest. And we begin to live our lives that way, totally self-interestedly. That's what civil society is like, according to Marx. That's why we use each other as means. I'm really only interested in myself, but I see you have something I want, and so we engage in an economic transaction or whatever it is. That's all really self-interested at the end of the day, according to Marx. And so these rights, and advocating for protecting them and protecting these rights more generally, only serves to reinforce and maintain the politically emancipated state as it is, only serves to reinforce and maintain civil society as it is, maintains, reinforces this idea that human beings are isolated individuals only really concerned with their own self-interest. And so these rights are inimical, Marx thinks, to genuine community. And human emancipation is going to consist in some sort of genuine social community. These rights are incredibly detrimental to that. That's Marx's criticism. Just a few more points that Marx makes. One of the things he says is that when you're considering these rights and you're considering the politically emancipated state, species life, which we're going to see, has something to do with sociability. We've already kind of seen that, and when we were looking at human emancipation, we're going to put more details on it as we proceed. But species life, social life, appears as external to the individual and as a limitation of his original independence, right? The public life, that's not our real existence. The public life, which is where we go to protect all these rights and so on. Public life is kind of alien. It's remote to us. And the things that are dealt with there, all these rights and other people more generally, right? And other people's interests. Because when you're engaged in public life, you're supposed to be concerned with the general interest. Well, those are all going to be limits on your own self-interest. It's somewhat remote from you, this public life with concern for the general interest. That's remote from us. But also, when we start thinking about it, other people are limitations on our freedom, as we've been seeing, right? This is another sense in which species life appears as kind of external or alien to people in a politically emancipated state. According to the theorists of the politically emancipated state, these classic liberal democratic theorists, the only bond between people is natural necessity, private interest, and the preservation of their property. The reason we get together is because we want to preserve our lives and our property. We want to keep all, because we're interested in ourselves. We're interested in our lives. We're interested in doing what we want to do with our stuff. And we can kind of see that if we don't get together to form a society, our lives are going to be in danger, and we're not going to be able to enjoy our property, right? And so the communal bond, it's not really all that communal at all. It's made out of self-interest, out of private interest, right? That's the idea. Lastly, an idea that we've already kind of talked about. In these rights of man, political community is a mere means for preserving them, for preserving these rights. We've already kind of talked about this idea. So I trust at this point that it's pretty clear, given the background that we've had in people like Hobbes and Locke, it's pretty clear that Marx has them in his sights here. He is criticizing their political projects, because everything that we've talked about can more or less be applied to them. For Locke and Hobbes, were originally in this state of nature totally free. And it's out of a desire to preserve our person and our property. It's out of this self-interest that we decide to start a community. But the whole point of the community is just to preserve and maintain our self-interest, right? And so we get all these rights, and the community is supposed to protect all these rights. Why? To protect self-interest. And so it's no surprise, Marx would say, that Hobbes and Locke think of the human being not as a political animal, right? We saw Hobbes explicitly rejecting that. They reject that idea. Human being's not a political animal. Human being is naturally asocial. Human being is naturally an isolated monad, right? You can find these ideas also in Rawls, or, obviously Marx didn't know about Rawls, but Rawls, in as much as he's influenced by people like Locke, is also going to be subject to some of these very same criticisms from Marx. That consider the way that Rawls thinks about people in the original position. They are mutually disinterested. I don't care if you do well. I don't care if you do poorly. Right? What Rawls is saying, he's creating these human beings in the original position that are naturally asocial. They're mutually disinterested. Viewing human beings in that way, Marx would say, naturally lends toward viewing human beings as these isolated monads who are merely seeking to further their own interests, as Rawls puts it, right? And these things, right? So Rawls is you even, right? Mutually disinterested people seeking to further their own interests. Conceiving of human beings in that way is inimical to human emancipation, to genuine community, to genuine sociability. And we're going to see why Marx thinks that as we proceed and as we put a little bit more flesh on the bones of his view of human emancipation and of species being, species life, and so on. We're going to be returning to those themes as we proceed to get a better idea of what exactly he has in mind here and what exactly the alternative to a politically emancipated state is supposed to be.